Hey, I'm Molly Kohler from Lovely Threads, and I'm going to be showing you how to do some straight line quilting today. First thing that you're going to need to do straight line quilting is a ruler. I'm going to show you my favorite one. This is a QCR Curvet ruler from So Kind of Wonderful. This is not sponsored. I just really like this ruler. It's comfortable in my hand. It's got a curve and a straight line and great markings, and mostly it's comfortable. That's why I choose to use it most of the time. Okay, here's the rulers that I use. This is the QCR Curvet that I showed you. It comes with a convex and a concave version. I actually don't use my concave very often. I do use this one because the curve, the way it fits in my hand, is just perfect between my pinky and my thumb. So comfortable. I also use this mini version. A mini smaller ruler is great if you have smaller spaces. It's a little easier to maneuver around. This one is from Angela Walters and Creative Grids. I like this one as well. It has a curve on the end, which I don't find myself ever using. It has two colors of markings and different width markings this way and this way. But it's good. It has non-slip on the back. So it's a nice ruler. I don't use it as often. This is from the Quilted Pineapple. It's her 5-inch edge, I think she calls it. I do love hers also. Hers have numbers for the inches. 1, 2, 3, 4. This is a 5-inch. Markings both ways. So a different marking for every 1/4 inch it changes. So you can do a 1/2 inch, an inch, 1/4 inch, you know what you're doing. So this size is really handy too. You might want one that's a 5-inch size and then a little bigger. This one's probably 10 inches long. Are both good to have. You're also going to want a ruler base. This is an upgrade, I believe, on most brands. I have Handy Quilter, Amara. This is my ruler base. It slides on and off really easy. I leave it on all the time if I'm custom quilting. I only take it off when I'm doing edge to edge. I also have their Surefoot, which has a little deeper profile, and it keeps the foot from jumping on top of the ruler and breaking it. And that is the foot I use for my custom quilting all the time also. For this quilt, I'm going to use my QCR Curvet ruler. I like how long it is for this quilt. It's going to be able to span the distance that I'm quilting from here to here without having to move my ruler. This ruler is a little easier to manipulate, but it's not going to span the distance very well. When you're using a ruler, you really only want to quilt the span of your hand if possible. That's going to be the space that's most stable. So you don't want to quilt to the very end of the ruler. You want the end to hang over where you quilt and then quilt the distance pretty much between your fingers where the ruler's not going to move around. If you get to the edge, your ruler might move and you get a little squiggle. When using a ruler, there's 3 points of pressure. You want to put a little bit of pressure on the ruler down towards the ruler base underneath the quilt. Then you're going to want to push the ruler a little bit against the edge of your foot, and the edge of your foot push against the ruler. Now, when I say pressure, you are going to want the pressure to be quite light. If you are holding the ruler and pushing it down really tightly against your ruler base, you're going to get some uneven quilting, even uneven stitches, some squiggles. You might even have problems with your tension or your thread breaking if you're pushing down too tight. So don't clench, relax, hold it firm and steady, but not too tight. The first thing I want to show you today is what you can do if your ruler isn't as long as the space that you are needing to quilt a straight line. What I recommend doing is positioning your ruler so that you can start and stop on a seam. That seam is going to help disguise any imperfections that might occur when you start and stop your machine from stitching. If there is not a seam to start and stop on and you're using a printed fabric, then you could strategically pick a place on the print of the fabric that will hide any imperfections, and that's where I would start and stop. You'll get better at this with practice and be able to start and stop wherever you want. Now let's quilt a little compass star inside of this diamond shape. I'm going to start by dividing the shape into 4 sections. I'm going to cut it in half horizontally, then stitch in the ditch and stitch it in half vertically. You could leave out these center lines of stitching, but there is a seam on one of these directions and it kind of puffs out weird if you don't quilt here. I like to do minimal marking on my quilts. Instead of drawing a straight line out from the center, I'm just going to hold my ruler in a straight line and make little marks where the stitching is going to come to a point. I'm using a water-soluble chalk pencil from Clover. It actually wears off really easy. I've had no problem using it in the past. Now I'm going to start my stitching at one point and stitch straight into the marking that I made. And then I'm going to stop the stitching, rotate my ruler, and stitch out to the outer point. We're going to be doing 2 layers in this star. So when I do my inside layer, I'm going to leave a space on those outer points about the width of a thread. This is going to give me just the right amount of space to nestle my outer layer of stitching down into that point with overlapping any stitch lines. Once again, I'm just going to stitch to the points that I marked, stop for a second, and then stitch to the corners. You can do the same design in a flying geese block. So I'm going to lay my ruler straight through the middle of the flying geese block and just make a little dot at the measurements where I want to start and stop my points. Once again, I'm just going to glide my foot along my ruler, stop for a moment at the seam, and reposition my ruler. I'll stop the stitching at the dot that I made, reposition my ruler, and quilt a line to the opposite corner. If possible, it is best to hold the ruler towards your body or to the left of the foot. These diagonal lines that come to a point give a lot of direction to your quilt. They're very dynamic and they can point the eye to a focal point or something that you might want to draw attention to. I'm using the same principle here as I did in the star shape, leaving a little gap so I do not have overlapping lines of stitching. On this next section, I'm going to use the second line in on my ruler as a guide to space out my stitching. This is going to create a 3/4 inch spacing between the lines. I like to start off by stitching in the ditch, and that gives me a guideline where to start and stop my short ends of stitching. If you're uncomfortable using the ruler as a guide, you could go ahead and pre-mark all of these lines. Here I am putting that second line from the outside of the ruler right on top of the seam, holding it steady and then gliding my machine along from one edge of the white to the next. I will just stitch in the ditch between lines of stitching, and then as I move over, I just put that same second line in right on top of the line of stitching, and that gives me perfectly spaced vertical lines. These vertical lines of stitching are just going to melt into the background and the diagonal lines are going to really pop. One thing I like to do with straight lines is divide a space into a different shape. I'm using the seams as a guide here and then sewing a diagonal line straight to the center and then a diagonal line opposite to the next side. This is going to give me a chevron shape, and then I'm going to use the lines on my ruler to add some echoes to that original line. I really love the look of repeating lines. Now I want to echo that same shape on the bottom half of this pink space. I'll have to advance my quilt so that it all fits within my quilting space. Once again, I'm going to use the seam as a guide of where I'm going to start my line of stitching. Use my ruler, and I'm just gliding my foot along the edge of the ruler, meeting the point I previously quilted, adjusting my ruler, quilting back to the seam again. Then I'm going to start at the bottom of this section because it's a little easier to use my ruler from the bottom up than from the top down. I'll use the lines on my ruler as a guide for my spacing here, and I'll do some repeating lines once again inside this pink space. Now I'm going to end up with two chevron shapes that kind of kiss in the center and two triangle shapes on either side. I don't like the huge gap which is created by just leaving those triangles open. So I'm going to just do one outline inside the triangles, and the spacing is bigger than the lines inside the chevron shape. So that's going to create some contrast and make it look like a different section. I'll clip my threads here, and then I'll repeat that same echo of stitching inside the triangle shape on the right hand side here. Let's talk a little bit about how you can use straight lines to create amazing designs. I loved the teal section of this quilt. It seemed like it needed to be more of a focal point. So I used lines spaced very close together, which is a contrast to the quilting in the other sections of this quilt. In this photo, you can see one of the compass star shapes. It kind of gives your eye a place to stop and rest. And as you can see, the vertical lines in the white fabric have kind of disappeared into the background, which is exactly what I wanted them to do. Here's another shot at the center of the quilt so you can see how cool those closely spaced lines look in contrast to the other areas. I'm excited to see what you create with your rulers and straight lines.